I got a dog this time. He's gonna stay down here probably, so admire him while you can. Hey friends, and welcome back to Intro to Media Studies. This topic is going to be heavier than the other ones. It's going to cover some current events, and it's going to touch on things like racism and violence, specifically in protests or against protests. There's also a lot that you can say about this topic, and it was really hard to narrow it down to just a few examples. So if you would like a part two on this, please let me know in the comments below. And I don't know if you can see very clearly, but I have my trusty mug again. I'm a writer. Anything that you say or do may be used in a story. I purposefully chose this mug because we're going to be talking about how fiction and news and reality all intersect and interact with each other. I was going to set this mug back here just so that you know it's there. And I brought this up for two reasons: to emphasize that reality and fiction and news and social media are not as divided as you think they are. And the second reason why I wanted to point this out, especially when it comes to news media or social media, and even in some fiction too, there's sometimes going to be little messages in the back. You can see it, your mind still gets the info that this is there, whether or not you were conscious of it. They can play into certain biases if you're not aware. For example, when someone's covering the 9/11 attack, someone might be saying, oh, there was an enemy present, there were these terrible people that attacked us. And then they might show a picture of someone with darker skin or someone wearing a certain head covering. And whether or not the news person intended to make that connection between the ones hurting us and whoever was in that picture or who was centered in that picture, that connection is already made. This plays more into psychology than it does into media studies, but it's still important to be aware of that. If you're aware of that connection between the picture and someone saying the bad guys, then you could be more aware of any biases either on your part or on the media's part. Because it's always really important to be aware of certain biases or certain messages that are within the media. So I just want to let you friends know I will try to get more of a message across than I can with just speaking. And sometimes I will do that with a mug, a picture in the background, costumes like I did in my last video, just things like that. And it's more common than you think to have these subliminal messages, especially when it comes to ads and news media. Of course, though, some messages aren't subliminal, some are just right out there. So if you haven't been following news in Southeast Asia, Thailand and Myanmar are now facing military coups and military regimes. When the people go to protest, the Thai and the Bamar have been using this salute. If this looks familiar, it's because it's from the Hunger Games. Hunger Games is a 2008 dystopian novel that follows a young woman named Katniss Everdeen as she takes her sister's place in these gladiatorial style games. She fights for her survival as well as the survival of her family, her friends, her home district, and not long after, these simple games turn into this deadly and fierce rebellion for freedom, for democracy, for survival. Now, when Katniss first takes her sister's place in the deadly Hunger Games, her district sends her this message, they send her this gesture as a way of solidarity, as a way of saying, we're with you. And then in the games, Katniss does the same thing with an ally, with someone that she's supposed to eventually kill, but she refuses to kill and ends up being friends and supporting her. And then when her ally dies, spoilers, Katniss flashes this sign in honor of the other district. So this symbol has become one of rebellion, of standing up for what you believe in, for the little guys. And in Thailand and Myanmar, they have been protesting with this sign since about 2014. In 2014, a coup d'etat happened in Bangkok right before Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1 came out in theaters. So when the protests began, not long after the film So when the protest came out, not long after the film came out, people started using this from pop culture, and this was a way to get people from other countries, especially in the West, to understand more of what's going on. And especially February of this year, the Bamar have been using this sign more often as they've been facing more and more harsh treatment from their military regime. An internet social movement researcher named An Xiao Mina explains that Southeast Asia is misunderstood a lot by the outside, especially by Western and white countries. So when you see the protesters doing this, they are making that connection to get you more aware of what's going on in their part of the world and to garner more sympathy and hopefully some aid for their cause in freeing them from this tyranny. Mina then goes on to say that these symbols don't just come out of nowhere, and that in fact this symbol from the Hunger Games has roots in the Scouting movement, what we in the West would probably know as the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Guides, and those kind of organizations. So these protests were influenced by protests in film and fiction. In the Hunger Games series, it's influenced by the Roman Empire and also just protests in general. So it's more of history influencing fiction, influencing history. Bless you. And Mina perfectly captures this sentiment with this quote. And that's both the story of the power of fiction and the story of the power of political movements to turn fiction into reality and help us all kind of understand the story behind people's suffering, behind people's challenges. The dog wanted to leave, so no more dog. So this is just one example of how fiction and news media interact with each other, but not all interactions between fiction and news are positive. On Twitter, writer Sarah Mughal Rana wrote this whole thread about how Muslims are portrayed in media. The first show that she points to is Tiny Pretty Things, which shows a Muslim flirting with someone in a prayer room, a sacred space, and then later he makes out with the person. And I should have to explain how that is disrespectful to faith and religion, but in case you really don't know, or you're just really white, prayer spaces are supposed to be very holy. You keep them sacred, meaning it's just for prayer. And this goes for any kind of religion. Like, if you're gonna portray someone Jewish, don't have them just making out randomly in a synagogue. If you're gonna portray a Christian, don't have them randomly have a fling in church. Just don't. Sarah points out how often people treat Muslims in fiction is mainly them freeing themselves from oppressive standards by kissing in prayer spaces or ignoring certain parts of their faith. The other example that Sarah discusses is the Netflix show Elite. A young woman takes off her hijab as a way to make her empowered, as a way to say that she's not going to hold herself back anymore and she's not going to let any sexist standards hold her back. And Sarah emphasizes that wearing a hijab is a choice. Telling Muslims not to wear a hijab would be similar to telling someone not to wear a yarmulke. They are significantly tied to their faiths, worn by choice. And becoming a hijabi is a big deal for many women, and as far as I could research, some non-binary people too. And it's not a choice taken lightly, like a lot of thought is given to this. So by portraying Muslims as only being empowered when they take off their hijab is erasing a lot of their autonomy and also minimizing their faith. You're saying that it's not that big of a deal. Sarah goes more into other more general misrepresentations of Muslims in media, but they all can pretty much be summed up as don't portray Muslims as sexist, as racist, as terrorists, or as jerks. And I'm gonna come back to 9/11 because I remember when news was going around about how there were Islamic terrorists who hijacked the planes and destroyed the towers and the Pentagon and the field in Pennsylvania. There was a lot of bad information and rumors going around and just flat out lies and conspiracies. And I remember there were two big things that came up a lot. One was that anybody wearing a head covering was a Muslim. And this is not true. A lot of Sikhs were targeted too, and they had nothing to do with this. And the second big theme that came up, that any Muslim could be a terrorist. In a lot of movies after that and in certain shows, whenever you saw someone who was Muslim on screen, they almost always had something to do with crime, whether or not it was on an airplane or whether or not it was hijacking or kidnapping, it didn't matter. Muslims were either the bad guys or they were the damsels in distress who needed to not wear hijabs anymore. And it's sad, the way that news portrayed Muslims did affect the stories we told. And then by reading those books or watching those shows or watching those movies and just seeing all these Muslims being portrayed in such horrible ways, it just reinforced this idea of Muslims being bad, of Muslims not having any redeeming qualities. And I want to make a quick note here. It's important to hear from multiple points of view, whether or not they are related to you in any way. For one thing, it just humanizes them. It just shows them as being real people with feelings, jobs, fears, careers. But it's also important to embrace intersectionality in media because it avoids this kind of problem, this demonization of a certain group based on race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, any factor really. Any demographic can have fringe weirdos, but that does not mean that you should only portray people of a certain group as always the bad guys, as always the criminals. And it's worth noting too, as far as I could tell, nobody hired a Muslim sensitivity reader or viewer. So if you don't know, a sensitivity reader or viewer is someone who reads or watches your work and goes over to make sure that the representation is as good as possible. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to have one person speak for the entire community, but they can give you a good idea of how to represent a community or a demographic in a way that's respectful. Not everyone has the time or energy to be a sensitivity reader or viewer, but if you're going to be making media or producing media that covers certain demographics you're not a part of, get a sensitivity reader or viewer. One more example that I want to share. So for those who don't know me, I'm a writer and I hope to publish some books someday. And one of my current works in progress has a character. He is going to be one of the main antagonists. And I was trying to think, if he's going to be a bad guy, why don't I play around with that and give him an ironic name? And by playing around for a bit, I came up with the name Eugene Goodman. Now, if any of you have been paying attention to the news, then you should know where this is going. January 6th, the insurrection at the Capitol in America. There was a black man who was a security guard at the Capitol who led the mob away from the Senate chamber, and he saved many lives that day. And that black guy's name is Eugene Goodman. And I bring this up because I know there's going to be some people who say, well, it's just a coincidence. No one's going to really care that you have this one fictional bad guy with the same name as this in real life good guy. Thing is though, that guy is black, my character is white. So when I do publish this book, when someone were to read the name Eugene Goodman, they aren't going to think, oh, that's a clever name, that's ironic. This name that means like good person, good man, and this guy's an antagonist. No, they're going to be thinking, oh, just like the black guy, because we heard the story of the security guard Eugene Goodman first. And I can always make up another name for this guy. It's fiction. But you can't make up news, you can't make up reality. And it's important to be mindful of what you're taking from the real world when you're working on your own media, especially fiction media. It's like if you were to name a character George Washington. No one's going to think that's just a random name. They're going to make connections to the real person. And like I was saying earlier with the subliminal messages, whether or not you're aware of it, your mind still makes that connection. I mean, if you're aware of it, then you know how to handle those biases better. You know how to process that information more fully, more effectively. If you're not as aware of that connection, though, that can lead to perpetuation of stereotypes, like the aggressive Black person or Muslims who need empowerment in the form of taking off their hijab. And that's all I got for you today, friends. I'm sorry that this video isn't as happy or as silly as some other videos I've done, but this is a really important topic that I really wanted to cover. And especially with the protests going on right now, I feel like it's really, really, really important that people understand the impact that fiction can have on the real world and how we can use the news and fiction to work together to improve our lives. So the next video is going to be on intersectionality in news media and in social media. If you liked this video, then please leave a like, comment, subscribe to my channel, and if you have anything to spare, I would really appreciate a tip in my coffee, link down below in the description box, and I will see you next time. Bye, friends.